Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Gilmore, and today I'm joined by my colleague and our director, Rhys Phillips. Welcome, Rhys.
Thank you, Chris. Nice to be here.
Rhys and I are both advisors at Strategy First Financial Planning, and today we're going to be hearing from Rhys on the topic of estate planning and intergenerational wealth transfer. Now, this has to be one of the most interesting topics of discussion with clients because it's complex, it's not well understood, it impacts all living generations and some not yet born, and relates to taking care of the well-being of our entire families. Now, before we get into it, a reminder that the information discussed today is general in nature, or general advice, does not take into account your objectives, your financial situation or needs, and before making any decisions, we recommend seeking advice from the relevant professional. Now, we have an ageing population, and this is front of mind for a lot of people, including us. But Rhys, can you give us an idea of the current landscape and also take us through what estate planning actually is?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'd be happy to. So a lot of the context that I'm going to share with you guys today probably isn't new to you. Chris mentioned the fact that we are all getting older. We probably don't need reminding of that fact. But to give you some context, if you look at the left-hand side of the slide I've got on screen here today, what it shows is the proportion of the population in Australia aged over 65. You can see that curve is increasing pretty steeply. It does project into the future. It kind of tells you everything you need to know in a glance. We're getting old, and we're getting old kind of quickly. The second big statistic that I think is important when it comes to the context of why estate planning and intergenerational wealth transfer is important is the sheer volume of assets that is potentially going to change hands in the next 20 years or so. There have been plenty of studies done on this. The figure ranges from somewhere around $3.5 to $4.5 trillion, so a pretty significant amount of money, as you can see. And that's going to change hands at some point in the next 20 years. Another interesting part of that is what that $3.5 trillion is made up of, and 75% of it is family homes and superannuation. So huge amount of wealth tied up in those two assets, likely to transfer to the next generations in the coming years. But what is estate planning? So you asked the question, Chris, what are the basics of estate planning? I think the easiest way for me to describe it is it's what happens to your assets and your affairs once you've passed away. That concept might sound pretty familiar to most of you, and there really is sort of two components of it. One comes to the way you structure your assets. One is more a documentation side of things, so getting the appropriate documents in place. But by and large, an estate plan is something that is designed to ensure you get the best chance of achieving what it is you want to achieve for those future generations and for your assets once you pass away. It can be quite a complex subject. Chris has touched on that in his introduction. We are only going to go into it at a very high level today because it does, generally speaking, require input from a number of professionals. So financial advisors are one, accountants, estate planning solicitors might be other examples, but they will all help you to craft that plan to give you that best chance of achieving what you want to achieve. On the right-hand side of my screen here, what I've highlighted is some of the trade-offs that generally come along with estate planning. Some of the objectives people are looking to achieve might be asset protection, certainty, tax effectiveness, flexibility even. It's rare that you can get all four of those at once. So for most people, once we've sat down and understood their objectives, their estate plan is going to be a compromise of all these things. But it's a compromise that's tailored to you and what you need. So Chris, hopefully that gives you a little bit of an introduction into what estate planning actually is.
Okay, so that sort of sets the scene. So two questions for you, Rhys. The first is estate planning for everyone? And the second would be, can you give us some examples of catalysts that may suggest someone needs to go and review their estate plan?
Yep, I'd be happy to, Chris. I've got my little generic family up on screen here, and I can almost guarantee that when we say the words estate planning, most people gravitate rather towards this end of the spectrum, the grandparents, the older generation in this scenario. And it is true, estate planning is very important for them, but what I imagine most people don't consider as readily is the fact that this second tier here, who I will loosely call the young parents, they probably need estate planning just as much as that older generation. In fact, the only people on my little generic family diagram here that don't need estate planning is probably these kids. They're a bit too young. So whenever dependents come into your life, so kids in this example, that's a great example of when you might need sort out your estate planning. However, even if you are at the older end of the spectrum and you sorted out all your estate affairs when you were young parents or younger, it is always worth getting them checked, simply because one of a number of catalyst events can have occurred during that time, which might prompt your will to be invalid, or some of your documents to need updating, or just your plans have changed. So a couple of those things, some of them sound relatively obvious. Changing your relationship. You're getting married, getting divorced, perhaps. You're having children, grandchildren have come into your life, perhaps. A serious medical event, and probably one that some people will laugh at, but the idea of going on a big family holiday could be a catalyst for getting all your affairs in order. So, Chris, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of who estate planning is for, and as I've kind of alluded to here, it's most people.
Yeah, it does. And funnily enough, I think one of those examples that I experience most commonly with my clients is, look, we're going on a family holiday. We're both going to be on a plane. There's a risk that this thing goes down and that the kids are going to be left with an absolute mess if we don't get our estate planning in order. So that's the one I come across most frequently. But you mentioned structuring as well as documentation. Structuring is extremely complex and very specific to a family's situation. We might cover that another time, but could you touch on the documentation side of things, which tends to be pretty, as I understand it, pretty consistent across all estate planning needs?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Chris. So the documents themselves will certainly be customized to reflect whatever the individual objectives are, but generally speaking, there is a set of documents that most people will need that forms part of their overall estate plan. I'll first talk about wills. That's the one that most people are familiar with, most people have heard of. In its simplest form, what a will does is it directs what happens to your assets when you pass away. You can also include some additional features in your will, things like who might look after minor children until they're of age. You can customize them to quite a significant degree, but at their core, it is about what happens to my assets when I pass away. There are varying spectrums of how complex wills can be, and they'll obviously be tailored to your needs. At one extreme simple end of the spectrum is the old-fashioned post office will, which is legally binding, but very few people will recommend you use one of those. At the other end of the spectrum, you can have wills that encompass a whole range of wishes, including things called testamentary trusts. Now, I'm not going to go into them in detail today, just the tip of the iceberg. What they are is a powerful vehicle that you can write into your will that dictates where your money goes into a trust for whichever beneficiaries you select, and you can be very creative around the conditions you put on those trusts. Can help a lot in terms of asset protection, also a very tax-effective vehicle. So that's the other end of the spectrum there. An important thing that gets raised quite often is superannuation. So most people automatically assume that their superannuation is going to form part of their estate. The simple fact of the matter is, unless you specifically nominate it to, it won't. So one of the things that your estate planning team and your advisors will look at is ensuring that you have the right superannuation death benefit nominations in place to ensure that that superannuation is included in that broader bucket. As I touched on right at the beginning, given that the $3.5 trillion that's going to change hands, a big chunk of that is in superannuation, it's clearly something we can't ignore. And to round out with a scary statistic, if you look at the right-hand side of my screen here, most people in this country do not have a valid will. Some people have wills that they think are in effect, aren't actually valid, but that 60 to 70% of Australians aren't covered by a valid will. That's a pretty scary thing. And if that's not a catalyst for people to get their affairs in order, frankly, I'm not sure what is. Skipping ahead, there are two other main documents that form part of a general estate plan. The second one of these is powers of attorney. Some of you may be familiar with this concept. A power of attorney basically allows someone to do anything from a legal and financial perspective that I can do. So for example, if I gave Chris my power of attorney, that means he can open bank accounts for me, buy and sell my assets, do all the things that I could generally do. These documents, again, much like wills, can be customized to the nth degree. You can put a lot of flexibility or restriction in it, depending on what your preference is. But where they're most commonly used is to allow someone to act where you are unable to. It might be because you're overseas temporarily, but a big common reason is due to mental incapacity or illness of some kind. It's a really important and powerful document to have in place, and it does cause, it saves your family an awful lot of time and stress and heartache in an environment where, if you've lost your mental capacity, they're probably already quite concerned and quite stressed. So a really important thing to have in place. It is a fail-safe, but better to have that fail-safe in place and not need it than to find yourself in need of it, but without it there, because you cannot make a power of attorney, Chris, once you have lost your capacity. Similar to powers of attorney, enduring guardianships. Concept is very similar. They are documents that effectively allow you to make decisions for people. Enduring guardianships are much more focused on health and lifestyle decisions. This one sounds a little bit morbid when we talk about it, but it is ideas around deciding what kind of medical care you might receive, ability to turn off life support, things like that. So again, a worthwhile thing to have in place, hopefully only ever as a contingency, but as I mentioned earlier, the amount of energy, time, money, and stress you can save your loved ones by having these few simple documents in place is astronomical. So we highly recommend it, Chris.
Absolutely. So estate planning is more than just getting a will done from the post office. There's a lot more complexity, a lot more design that goes into it. But access to those other professionals who we trust and collaborate with is a great resource for our clients to get these things in order. We will be hosting a further set of webinars later in the year in partnership with a specialist lawyer to talk about some of these other subjects in more detail, and I think our clients will find those really interesting. So that covers the scenarios of death and incapacity, which importantly we never really plan for. Estate planning is often the bottom of our priority list because, let's face it, we're so busy and we have so much to do before we die. But we see and hear so many stories of family situations where estate planning has been forgotten, it's done on the cheap, or without being updated. And basically the worst outcome is that the kids are grieving after having lost mum or dad. Dealing with the estate is a nightmare, and it actually ends up severing those relationships between siblings. And this is the worst possible outcome, and proper estate planning and even engagement with your beneficiaries can help reduce the risk of this happening. But on a lighter note, the second topic of today's discussion is intergenerational wealth transfer. Put simply, it's the flow of wealth through generations. It could also just be assisting the next generation with establishing themselves financially. Now, Rhys, can you talk a little bit about this and reflect on some of the conversations that you have with clients about helping the next generation?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're right, Chris. This is, by its very nature, a bit of a more light-hearted subject because we aren't necessarily talking about death. It is considering whether to pass assets to beneficiaries. Normally it's the next generation, but if we're honest, there's no reason why it can't go upwards as well as downwards. But allowing those people that you care about to benefit from the wealth that you've accumulated. There's plenty of examples as to when this occurs. Looking at kids or grandkids and funding education is a great example. Probably one of the more common ones we've seen in recent times is helping your kids get into the housing market. Real problem for plenty of young people around Australia today. So the Bank of Mum and Dad, as it's affectionately known, has been quite key to getting that generation into the property market. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can structure that assistance. And again, it goes beyond the scope of today's discussion to go into them in detail, but at a high level, things like gifting money to your children, loaning money to your children, potentially being guarantor on their loans. For people that are asset rich and cash poor, you can even tap into some of the equity in your house if required to help those kids. But that's one of the common decision points we're seeing. There is obviously pros and cons for each of those options, and it is important that you do get the right advice to work out which one is best for you. But that's one of the main areas we're seeing. A second area that's starting to grow in prevalence is the idea of what I will loosely call multi-generational vehicles. So setting up something like a trust or an investment company or even a charitable foundation that allows multiple generations of a family to get involved and to engage with managing that family wealth. It's probably selling a little bit short to say that it can be a complex discussion. It certainly can be, especially when you consider multiple generations of a family being involved in this. But we think that's a good thing. And in fact, whenever we are discussing intergenerational wealth with any of our clients, we do encourage open discussion amongst the family. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that you need to disclose every detail of your finances to your kids, your grandkids, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, whoever else is involved. But getting the family group together to work out what the purpose of this transfer is definitely key to part of this relationship. It's an area where we, again, much like estate planning, collaborate with other professionals to ensure that you get the best advice and the best outcome here. And it's an area where, much like some of the other services you will have received from us, we have a specialist offering both in the estate planning space and the intergenerational wealth transfer space, designed to ensure that in concert with your other professionals like your accountants, your solicitors, etc., that we develop a great outcome for you and your family. And part of that might include talking to the next generation or whoever it is that's going to be the beneficiary of your generosity to ensure that they actually get the most out of it as well, so that when you do pass that wealth on, it isn't squandered and it gets put to the use that you actually desire. So a big topic to discuss, Chris. Certainly an interesting one and a fun one in lots of cases, but becoming more and more common.
Absolutely. Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's a really, really fascinating area, and there are some wonderful discussions we have with clients, including helping them meet some pretty huge milestones, which is a bit of a privilege for us to be in that position, and the peace of mind that parents take, from helping a child get into their first home, is pretty mind-blowing. So at home, you might think that intergenerational wealth will never be for you or is outside of your reach, but how do we know unless we explore your values, the family situation, the path your kids are on, strategies, potential implications, but also leveraging from the other professionals in our network. If you get involved in these discussions with your kids and want to be able to assist, please reach out to us. Please raise it. We know the journey they're about to go on. We've been there, and we can share plenty of our own experience and also the experience of others, the people that we work with. So if anything has resonated with you throughout that discussion, write it down, email that through to your advisor. We'll pick it up. We'll address it with you. But that's it from us today. Thank you, Rhys, for sharing your expertise.
It's been my pleasure, Chris.
Thanks at home for listening. Bye for now, and take care.